Okay, so now I want to just touch a little bit on the North American bat monitoring program in itself and the different kinds of monitoring that would be included within this program. So to do bat monitoring, you definitely do not need to follow the NaBat program. To do acoustic monitoring, you definitely do not need to follow this program. Yeah, it all depends on the questions you are interested in answering with your bat monitoring. Like if you're looking to monitor migratory species, maybe in the spring and the fall, then the NaBat program probably isn't suitable for doing that kind of monitoring. But I just want to introduce it because if you have the equipment and you are able to contribute to this program, then I think it's definitely a benefit. So yeah, let's talk about it a little bit. So first, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the program. So it was developed in 2015 by the United States Department of Agriculture when they released this guide here, which you can get this guide free online, like you can download it. It is a little bit longer, but it is great to actually read through it and get the background. But it is a multi-agency and multinational program, and it was constructed to standardize the monitoring of the 47 bat species in Canada and the US. I know the program is called North American, but as it stands right now, I do not believe it encompasses the species found like in Mexico and elsewhere in North America, because there are just so many bat species. But at least it is covering the 47 bat species in Canada and the US. A need for standardized monitoring arose in an effort to address the questions about population declines associated with the emergence of white nose syndrome. And so while the original goal of the monitoring program was to gather information pertinent to white nose syndrome population declines, its design is also suitable for investigating the effects of wind energy development, climate change, and other potential causes of habitat loss on bat populations. So NaBat provides consistent monitoring methods, which includes colony counts, standardized grids, and acoustic surveys, in addition to other types of monitoring. So today I'm just going to touch on the acoustic surveys and the colony counts. So first, let's talk a little bit about acoustic surveys and what they are. So they're used to identify the presence of bats in an area by recording bat echolocation calls. So echolocation enables bats to create a mental map of their surroundings, which is how they fly in complete darkness without relying on strong night vision. The bat species in Canada do not typically have strong night vision. So during flight, bats are emitting calls or pulses at high speed that are projected out into the environment. So you can see that in the yellow here. And then when the sound waves of these calls come into contact with an object, they are reflected back to the bat, which you can see in purple. So then the bat then processes these reflected sounds to help it form a mental map. So that would be the purpose of echolocation. These calls are usually a higher frequency than humans are capable of hearing. The upper limit of our hearing typically falls between 12 to 20 kilohertz, depending on a variety of factors. However, the high frequency limit of most people is well below this frequency range, especially as they begin to age. So to monitor bats based on their calls, we have to record the calls with special microphones that can detect high frequency sounds. And then we take these calls and analyze them using special computer software to create an image of the call. And we call this a spectrogram, which you can see here. And we can use information on these spectrograms to get information about bat species and behavior. Yeah, so here you can see there are 3 different species within this file, and we can tell that by looking at it, which we'll do later this afternoon. Today, we're not going to get into like actually how to use the software. It's just too much information to cover within one day, but we do have instructional videos online. I sent out the YouTube link step by step using the software and all of that. So we have covered all of those topics. They're just in a video format instead of a webinar format. So you can actually pause and rewind as you go through, if that's useful. So for acoustic surveys, they're conducted during the summer for NaBat. And this is when bats are active, but before pups become volant. So for Atlantic Canada, we kind of arbitrarily set this from June 1st until July 31st. It's not a perfect window. It does depend on weather and that kind of thing, but we hope to capture non-volant bats or non-volant pups, essentially, the adults, I guess, within that window without counting the pups once they become volant. So by consistent monitoring of only adult bat populations without the pups, it allows for consistency and comparability between data sets and trends over time. Ideally, all acoustic surveys should be done during a period of good weather. So we define that as clear weather, no rain or fog, low wind speed, so winds less than 10 kilometers an hour, and then temperatures above 10 Celsius. This won't be necessary for all kinds of surveys, and I'll touch on that a little bit as I go through the surveys later. But if you can manage to meet these criteria, then that would be great. All the acoustic surveys should be conducted at least once per year to allow for between-year comparisons of statistical trends. Acoustic survey data do have a very important limitation. So while bat calls can be identified to species or categorical groups, they cannot be determined to originate from an individual animal, and thus no inference can be made about absolute population size. So acoustic surveys for bats provide information about magnitude of bat activity, and that's for stationary point surveys, or relative abundance of bats between sampling periods, and that would be for your mobile transects. So an increase or decrease in acoustic bat activity should not be interpreted as, should not be interpreted as an increase or decrease in population numbers without the use of additional, more robust survey methods targeted at population counts. So that's where that colony count piece comes in. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the stationary point survey specifically. So basically involves placing between 2 to 4 bat detectors in specific types of habitat over several nights. So I won't talk about this now because Jordi will cover it in the next section, but you have this grit cell. So it's a square divided in 4, so quadrant. And you can place a minimum of 2 detectors. So 1 detector in each of 2 cells, or actually you could place 4 detectors. So 1 detector in each cell. Ideally, you would place 4 if you have the equipment. And if you can place each detector in a different habitat type, that would be preferable as well. So for example, this detector is placed in a forested trail, this one's in an agricultural area, this one is at a freshwater site, and this one's at a forest edge. So it's a way to actually assess bat species presence, absence in different habitat types. So for your survey requirements, they should take place between 4 to 7 nights. So that's your monitoring period. Again, a minimum of 4 to 7, or a minimum of 4 nights, but ideally 7 nights. With the detector set to record 30 minutes before sunset until 30 minutes after sunrise. So you're just recording overnight. If you do monitor for 7 days, try for at least 4 nights of good weather. And we already specified what that is. So for these surveys, you don't really need to have good weather. The detector is waterproof, and the way Jordi will show you to set it up in a way that the weather conditions won't ruin your detector, your microphone, or anything like that. But if you are monitoring only 4 nights and all 4 nights the weather would be really bad, you just likely won't record bats. So it just may not be a good indicator of bat activity. So at least try for 4 nights of good weather. I know it's sometimes hard in Atlantic Canada, but ideally you'd have at least 4 good monitoring nights. So the strengths of stationary point surveys would be that they are better able to control factors that could influence the quality and quantity of the recordings, their mobile transects. And they also remove the habitat bias from sampling along roadways that are inherently associated with mobile transects. Limitation of these surveys. So the primary limitation is that these surveys cannot be used to estimate the relative abundance of bats. So because you put the detector passively out on the landscape, let's say you record 10 files, there's no way to know if 1 bat flew by that detector 10 times, creating 10 files, or 10 bats flew by the detector 1 time each, or something in between. There's just really no way to quantify that. So we have to recognize that these surveys are only used to measure bat activity, not relative abundance. Does that make sense? Hopefully everyone's nodding along. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are, oh.
Yep, in the chat.
Oh, just a yes, thank you. These are in our guide. This is more for like biologists or ecologists or management. It just gives you some population measures. You can use the data from these surveys to calculate if you're interested in that. And then this is also in our guide. We just have a little table that lets you know what equipment you may need for these surveys. your little checklist. Okay. So now I'm also going to go into mobile transects, so your second kind of acoustic survey. So these involve driving a vehicle at a very slow speed along a set route with the microphone fixed to the exterior of the vehicle so that you're recording bat passes while you're in motion. And you can see here we have 2 microphones on the roof of our vehicle. The mobile transects are driven consistently at a speed of 32 kilometers an hour. I know that's very specific. So the commuting flight speed of the majority of bat species would be less than 32 kilometers an hour. So the vehicle is traveling faster than a bat during these mobile transects. And as a result, each bat that you pass is assumed to be representative of a single individual. So you're passing bats as you drive and they can't catch up to you. So you can assume that each file you record is a separate bat that you have passed on your transect. Due to bat passes being indicative of the actual number of bats recorded, mobile transect data can be used to estimate relative abundance of bats. So NaBat recommends starting the mobile transect 45 minutes after sunset. However, we've done research in Atlantic Canada that demonstrates that bats are more frequently recorded between 10 and 11 p.m. And this would be consistent with a survey start time of approximately an hour to an hour and 15 minutes after sunset, depending on the survey date. If you have more questions on that, you can ask me because I did do that research. So you can just always ask me. The driving transects are conducted during the same period that your grit cell is being monitored. So if you are doing a cell with those stationary point survey sites, that 4 to 7 night monitoring period, your driving transect would be done during that same monitoring period. So you're monitoring the whole cell at the same time. Optimally, you do 2 mobile transects a year to increase accuracy in your abundance estimates, but that would not be a requirement. It might be difficult to fit in 2 transects if you only are monitoring a site for 4 nights, but if you do have a site set up for a week and you can fit in 2 mobile transects, that would be excellent if the weather complies. So your transects, like I said, they're driven consistently at 32 kilometers an hour, but it is still important to practice road safety and follow traffic rules. So while you are supposed to be driving consistently, if you need to stop for a stop sign, you have to stop for a stop sign. So keep that in mind. The roads used in the surveys should be secondary roads, so provincial highways or county roads, or tertiary roads, so county and forest roads with as few stops as possible. Transects need to be between 25 to 48 kilometers in length, and they need to fit within your grid cell, so that 100 kilometer squared grid cell, which Jordy will show you a bit later. The road cannot cross back on itself, so it needs to be at least 100 meters from another section of the transect, and that's to prevent bats from being counted more than once, which would bias the abundance estimates. So you don't want to ever cross back on yourself and accidentally count the same bat twice. There are no specific habitat requirements for these surveys, so the roads can be surrounded by many different kinds of habitat, including agricultural areas, wetlands, forested areas, even residential areas or small towns. The only real requirement is there should be a minimum of 3 meters between the vehicle and the tree canopy. So roads surrounded by dense forested corridors and low-hanging canopy should not be used, and that's just to protect your call quality essentially. You don't want your recorded bat passes to be affected by high clutter, which Jordy will discuss in a little bit as well. NaBat recommends directional microphones to reduce road noise from being recorded, which may impact the quality of the recorded bat passes. So on the right here, this is a directional microphone. It's actually the same omnidirectional microphone, but we put this directional horn on the mic. And so by doing that, you're really only recording anything that flies or goes directly above the microphone. So it only really records sound in one direction. However, again, we've done research in Atlantic Canada that indicates that omnidirectional microphones without the horn record higher quality and a higher number of bat passes. So like this mic here does not have the horn, it's omnidirectional. That actually works better. And again, if you have any questions on that, you can ask me. So we do recommend multi-directional microphones for these mobile transects, whether that's omnidirectional or hemidirectional. Don't worry about that. Jordy will explain that in the next section as well. But yeah, you want to use some kind of multi-directional microphone for these surveys, ideally. Driving transects should always be conducted on a night with suitable weather conditions. So this is actually really important for these surveys. If it's raining and you're using this kind of microphone, the rain will actually destroy the microphone. If you are using the other microphone type, it is waterproof or weatherproof, but it will affect your calls being recorded, which Jordy will explain. If you have a lot of water built up on the road from rain, that actually creates a lot of additional noise as well. So you don't want that either. And obviously, if you have high winds and you have a microphone sticking up above your vehicle, that's going to be problematic as well. And you also won't record bats. If the weather is bad, they won't necessarily be out that night. So you're kind of wasting your time anyway. So for these surveys, the good weather is really a requirement. So strengths of these surveys would basically just be that the bat passes are indicative of an actual number of bats recorded, so we can use these data to estimate relative abundance of bats. So that's really why we do these surveys. Your limitations would be that there may be a bias in species representation, as some bat species may be under or overrepresented depending on their preference for using roadside habitat. And I have a big red X over the northern myotis. It would be very difficult to record this species during mobile transects, and we'll get into that later today. This species is difficult to record acoustically anyway, and just the additional noise created by driving on the road makes it really hard to record the species during these surveys. And they're often not in roadside habitat either, right? They're in forested area. So yeah. Again, just some population measures you can calculate. And your equipment table. Any questions on the two types of acoustic surveys? Okay, so for colony counts, the first kind we have did I skip this? Oh, I totally skipped a slide, sorry. So for colony counts, this really may be the best survey method for gathering data on bat population size and trends. But again, we have to remind you that it provides population estimates at best. So colony counts really rely on two factors. So the first is availability, and that's just that the bats are actually present when you're doing the survey. And then it also relies on detectability, so that the bats are able to be observed during the survey. So if they are present, are you going to actually be able to see them? And there will always be variation in these factors depending on a number of variables like weather conditions, observer experience, roost characteristics, the individual bat, etc. So we cannot completely control these variables, which results really in only a population estimate. But it is still important to keep these colony counts as consistent as possible if you are able to do so. So the first kind we have would be our external roost counts. We also refer to these as emergent surveys because we're basically just counting bats as they are leaving and re-entering their roost site. So in Atlantic Canada, we also sometimes just refer to these in general as colony counts because they're typically used to count the number of bats in a maternity colony during the summer. So NaBat recommends that the emergent survey should start half an hour before sunset. However, 15 minutes before sunset has found to be sufficient in the Maritimes and areas affected by white nose syndrome. I just find bat populations are still so low that bats are not necessarily leaving the building that early. So I find 15 minutes more than enough time. But if you want to be sure, you can always start 30 minutes before sunset just to make sure you're not missing any bats. The emergent survey will finish up in 3 different conditions. So if you do not see any bats at all during your survey, you finish up an hour after sunset. If you are seeing bats exiting the structure, you wait, and then if you do not see a bat for at least 10 minutes, leave the building, you can finish up the survey. Or if really there's not sufficient light to allow for observation of bats, then you can finish up the survey at that time as well, because you're not seeing anything anyway. So your external roost count should be done at least once during the period of June 1st to July 31st. So again, we do these surveys before pups become volant for consistency, so before the pups are able to fly. If the standardized method is used over multiple years, it can give reliable data on whether the adult population remains stable or changes over time. And the more times an emergent survey is done for a given roost site during this period, the more reliable the population estimate for that roost. So we do encourage multiple surveys, but it's not a requirement. So if you could go to a site at least a few times, that would give you really a better estimate. So it's not described in the NaBat protocol, but another option would be to do an additional roost count once pups become volant, so once they're able to fly. so from August 1st to August 31st. If you do a count both early and then late in the summer, the second count will allow for the pups born that summer to be estimated so you can get an idea of reproductive output, which provides useful information on recovery of bat populations post-white nose syndrome. I will say though, you have a very narrow window where you can do this because once pups become volant, the bats start to leave the maternity roost. So you do have a very narrow window once the pups are volant to actually do that count and not miss bats that have already left the roost. But it's worth trying and seeing if you're able to do it, but it might be a little challenging to nail down the timing. If the external roost count occurs in one of those quadrants, so grit cells, where acoustic monitoring is also being done, you could do all of your monitoring during that same monitoring period, the 4 to 7 nights. That would be ideal. So I'm just going to very quickly go into instructions, I guess, how to do these surveys if you're interested. I am talking about these surveys in reference to structures, usually buildings, because usually we do these kinds of surveys at confirmed roosts, which are often buildings or bat houses. It's really hard to confirm roosts for the tree roosting bat species. So here for your province, I'm mainly likely talking about little brown myotis. But if you are doing a survey at a building, one person should be placed at every corner of the building so that all sides of the building can be observed at the same time. So this is obviously easiest with 4 people. So each person is only responsible for watching one side of the building at once. But you can do this with a minimum of 2 people, one person at each opposite corner. And then they would just have to be able to watch 2 sides of the building at once. So this probably isn't a great option for beginners, but more experienced people could definitely do surveys with only 2 people. So you just want to make sure that you're positioning people so the entire structure can be observed at the same time. And we do this because bats actually usually have more than one exit from a roost. I find like usually at least 2. So if you are only watching like the front of the building, you could be missing bats exiting out the back of the building as well. It is important that each observer only watches their own specific area of the building and that there is no overlap in the areas being monitored. So you don't want to accidentally count the same bat twice. So make sure everyone knows what parts of the building they're responsible for watching. You count bats both as they're leaving and entering the roost, and then you will subtract the bats that return to the roost from the total amount that left the roost to prevent recounting of the same individual. If bats are present or possibly present in multiple structures on the property, make sure you have enough people with you so you can properly monitor each structure so that population estimates are accurate. So often there might be like a bat house on the property that bats are in, but then they may also be in the attic or a barn or something like that. So it's always good to go to the property ahead of time and just check out what you actually see there, and then make sure when you actually go to do the survey that you do bring enough people. You'll want to make sure that people are standing as close to the building as possible to get a good view while still making sure that they can see the entire side of the structure. You'll want to minimize other factors that may prevent bats from leaving the roost. So we don't do surveys with headlamps or bright lights. If you're shining a light at the roost, it may actually prevent bats from leaving. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. And we also try to minimize loud noise. So don't be shouting to the person on the other side of the structure. Even if it's tempting when you see a bat to be excited, but try to be quiet, I guess, when you're doing these surveys. And again, it is important to have good weather during these surveys because if the weather is poor, the bats will likely stay at home for the evening and you're sitting out in the rain and not seeing any bats. So strengths of these surveys would be that they provide reliable estimates of bats at a particular roost. They're also fairly simple to do. Really, you just have to be able to count and see. And these surveys also cause minimal disturbance to the bats. You're just sitting on the lawn, watching them leave the building, and they're not bothered at all. So it's really a great survey in terms of that as well.
Just a question in the chat regarding using light near those when you do those counts.
Yeah.
What about putting red tape over the headlamp light?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, how disruptive that may be to bats. I definitely wouldn't shine any light at the roost itself because they have done research on actually shining like large lights at a roost and it prevents bats from leaving. I don't know if the red light would bother them or not. So I probably just wouldn't do that. But if you want to use like red light, just to like take notes and stuff with your headlamp, that would be something I would do. I just don't actually try to shine it like out at the roost or at the bats itself. And I know other places sometimes do use some lights with surveys. So I do talk to them and we do like kind of compare notes to see if that possibly does affect things or not. So we're always getting more information on that. But I would avoid shining light at the roost, even if it is like a red light, I guess, just in case. I don't know if that would even really help you see that much better. I know with some of these surveys, they do use like infrared cameras or they record like video of bats leaving. So that is another option if you have the funding again to purchase that equipment, which we don't. So we always just do like visual surveys with an observer. But yeah, I don't use light other than just to like take notes, and I do use red light then. Okay. All right. So limitations of these surveys would be that these kinds of surveys basically just don't allow for species identification because you're sitting outside watching these little blurs fly out of a building. And while in Nova Scotia, you can likely assume that they're little brown myotis because big browns aren't really confirmed roosting in buildings in the province. You can't say definitively. Sometimes you can have species roosting with other species. So you wouldn't be able to actually confirm this. So if you are trying to determine species presence absence in a roost site, then you could combine like an acoustic survey, a stationary point survey with your emergence survey. And that wouldn't necessarily be definitive. While you're doing the survey, you could have like a bat fly overhead that isn't actually in that roost, but it could give you at least some idea of the species or species group that are using that roost site. So I usually do that. I always give the example that at one house, I did record a hoary bat during the survey. And that doesn't mean that I think that a hoary bat was like roosting with all of these little brown myotis bats. I just think it flew overhead. So you really do have to be careful how you interpret those data. Okay. So external roost counts provide data again on these things. You can calculate these population measures. Okay, so the second type of colony counts would be your internal roost counts, and that includes counts at both maternity colonies and hibernacula. So the strengths would basically be that you can sometimes have close-up observation of roosting bats that can allow for species identification and sex, which can be used to calculate a variety of population measures. And this isn't in every case either. It depends how far away the bats are and if you handle them or not. But basically, these surveys do come with a lot of limitations. So hibernacula are considered critical habitat, and entering these sites, even if it is safe to enter in consideration of occupational health and safety standards, because these sites, a lot of these caves are actually quite dangerous to enter. Entering these sites requires special permitting. It also, letting someone else in. It also risks spreading the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. So you have to be really careful about equipment decontamination. Now we're also concerned about potentially exposing bats to SARS-CoV-2. Maternity colonies suitable for colony counts are often in residential, privately owned buildings. So you would have to get the homeowner's permission before accessing these sites. And doing counts at these sites also come with their own inherent health risks. Basically, we're worried about histoplasmosis primarily. So due to these reasons, we do not encourage people attending these workshops to do internal roost counts, unless for some reason they're done in very close collaboration with the provincial or federal agency responsible for the bat species being monitored. So if you already do these kinds of surveys for your job, like you work for provincial or federal government, that's fine. But if you don't, then we wouldn't advise doing these surveys. Or of course, unless you work for pest control and you are already going into people's houses, then that's fine. But if not, we don't advise that you do these kinds of surveys. They do provide data for quite a few different population measures, but yes. I sent this out as well. We don't really have to look at it. It's just supposed to be helpful if you're trying to figure out like what your questions maybe are and what kind of surveys you want to do. So like if you're wondering what species of bats you have in an area and then you're interested in these different population measures, maybe species richness, then you can know that you would you could do like a stationary point survey or an internal roost count, which again, we're not recommending. So if you are interested in species richness, then likely you'd want to do a stationary point survey. So you can kind of just use this as you're planning your monitoring, I guess, if it's helpful. Any questions, other questions I should say on any of that? No? Okay, let's go through some questions together then. I think these are all just multiple choice questions. So feel free to share your answer in the chat or unmute yourself. And it's always nice to hear friendly voices. Okay, so you decide you want to get information or some information on the number of bats in your area. Which type of survey or surveys could you do to get this information? A stationary point survey, a mobile transect, or an external roost count, or you cannot get this information from NaBat surveys. And there's so many of you that I'm going to require like at least 5 answers for these.
I've got 2 C's so far.
If you disagree too, that's fine.
Another C. Still only 3 answers. Okay, 4th C, 5 C's.
Okay, right.
6
Okay,
C's. Yeah.
good. Yeah, the answer is C. So stationary, I said number of bats, I left it vaguely intentionally. So stationary point survey would be bat activity. So that gives you really no idea about number. Mobile transect gives you species relative abundance. So that gives you some idea of number. But your external roost count also gives you a population estimate. So another kind of number. So really you could do either mobile transects or external roost counts to get an idea about number of bats. So either your species relative abundance or your population estimate. So that would be your best answer. C, good job. Okay, what is important when doing mobile transects? The weather conditions, the number of surveyors, the direction of the transect, or the type of the vehicle?
Oh, I see a bunch of people saying A. Lots of answers this time.
Yeah,
Everyone
confident
says
about
A.
this one.
Yeah.
Okay, right, weather conditions. I touched on that. You don't want to ruin your equipment, obviously, or not get any recordings. So that is important. Number of surveyors. You can do these surveys with 1 person. I would recommend having 2 just for safety. And so 1 person can concentrate on driving and the other one can kind of handle the detector and that kind of thing. Not that you have to do much with the detector during these surveys, but direction of the transect, it doesn't matter if you drive east to west or west to east. But once you do choose your direction, so if you drove east to west this year, you would drive the same direction next year, east to west. So you would maintain it for consistency, but it doesn't matter which direction you choose. Type of vehicle doesn't matter as long as you can get the microphone affixed to the exterior of the vehicle. Internal roost counts should only be done if there is close collaboration with the Provincial Wildlife Division, steps taken to ensure human safety, steps taken to ensure bat safety, or all of the above.
We got 4, 5, 6 D's, 7 D's.
Okay.
Lots of E's.
Okay, I don't think I need to go over this. I think it's just clear that we're not recommending these surveys unless all of these steps are taken, essentially. What is the minimum number of surveyors required to do an external roost count on a 4-sided building like this one?
I'm seeing 2, 4, and then C or C if experienced.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't specify. Okay, good. I think most people had it. So it's a little bit of a trick with the minimum. You could do a survey like this with a minimum of 2 people. This house looks very square. So you could put 1 person on each end. Ideally, you would have 4, 1 person on each side, especially if they are inexperienced. You'd probably want each person to only watch 1 side at once. 1 would not be enough people ever. 6 would still, you could bring 6 people and just have more people, that's fine. Especially, you do need to have a look at the building beforehand, because if you do have a building that has more like turrets or faces on it, it can be hard to see around, and you may actually need more than 2 or 4 people, even for a 4-sided building. But yeah, so the answer was C here. Good. What is a limitation associated with mobile transects? Species representation. Data can be used to estimate relative abundance of bats. Mobile transects have no limitations, or mobile transects require a large investment of time.
People are saying A.
Great. A, yeah. So you likely just won't record certain species during these surveys, or you're less likely to record them, essentially. Data can be used to estimate relative abundance of bats. This is true, but I'd say it's a strength, not a limitation. And D, to actually design your survey, that probably takes the most time, and like to test drive it. But once you have a transect actually planned out, these surveys take like about an hour to do, and you're recording a very small amount of data as well, like very small. So it doesn't actually take you a long time to analyze the data either. So these surveys really do not require a large investment of time after you get them really planned. You want to know if bats are using the habitat below. Which type of survey would be the best way to get this information? An external roost count. NaBat surveys do not gather data on habitat use. A mobile transect or a stationary point survey?
Five Ds.
Good. Yeah. So there's no building here to do an external roost count. There's no road for a mobile transect. So yeah, a stationary point survey, that's the best way to determine species presence, absence, and habitat types. So yeah, good. Okay. You have reports that bats may be roosting in the building below. What would be the best way to confirm this? A mobile transect, an external roost count, an internal roost count, or a stationary point survey?
I had a B come in real quick.
And I am watching to see who are answering, or the people that are answering these questions. So I can see if your name never comes up, and I would encourage you to answer some of them.
Got a bunch of Bs.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah. So again, there's no road here, but also that wouldn't really be an appropriate way to see if bats are in a building. External roost count, great option. You just sit outside and watch bats leave. I didn't touch on this earlier, it's in the guide, but when you go to these sites, a good way to determine where the exit may be would be where guano is deposited on the wall or on the ground. Usually there's an exit above that. Internal roost count, you could do this. You need permission to go into the building. You'd need your safety equipment like your respirators. And you could try that. But of course, then you risk disturbing the bats as well, potentially transmitting something to the bats. That's also a concern. And also, it may be hard to find the bats inside the building. It's not necessarily that they're just roosting in a corner of the attic. They may be between boards. They may be in the walls. And so this really isn't your best method, even if we were recommending it. You could do a stationary point survey. You could put a detector out and see if bat activity increases at dawn and dusk. So when bats are leaving and returning to their roost. But it can be hard to do this, especially if with roosts, with numbers being so low. If you only had like 10 bats at this site, it may be kind of hard to determine if activity increases or decreases. So I would do an external roost count would really be the best way to confirm this. But you could always combine it with a stationary point survey if you wanted for species purposes. There is a maternity colony in the bat house below. How would you get an idea of what species are using this roost? A stationary point survey, it would not be important to determine what species are using the roost, an external roost count, or a mobile transect.
Everyone so far saying A.
Good. Yeah, exactly. So again, it's an idea of what species. It's not a confirmation, but you could sit out and if you wanted to still do an external roost count, that's good to get numbers. And then you could have your little detector with you to get an idea of what species are using this roost. Yeah. Okay, stationary point surveys are used to measure population abundance estimates, species magnitude of activity, sex ratio, or bat health. Lots of bees, great. Right, species magnitude of activity.
There's also an A or B question.
An A or a B.
Require some.
Yeah, so again, stationary point surveys cannot give you population abundance estimates. Your colony counts can give you population abundance estimates because you're actually counting bats leaving a population like a roost. Your acoustic survey, so your mobile transect, can give you species relative abundance. Again, it's not really a population measure. So the stationary point surveys, when you're actually putting the detector out on the landscape, oh, okay, I can stop talking. But yeah, you put it out on the landscape, bats are flying by, but you can't quantify that. That would be your magnitude of activity. And I mean, we do recommend, and I'll touch on this hopefully at the end of the day, but really the strength in these surveys is in longevity. So if you do have like an idea of species magnitude of activity over 5 years or more, potentially, you have to be careful with how you do this, but potentially that magnitude of activity could be indicative of population increase or decline, more of an indication. But yeah, the longer you do these surveys, the more confident you can be in interpreting magnitude of activity more at a level of a population. But again, you have to be careful how you do that. Okay, you have a grit cell you want to monitor. The cell has a diverse array of habitat types, 2 structures where bats may be roosting, and is easily accessible by long stretches of roadway. What surveys would you want to consider doing? I don't think I need to read them all, but you can just have a look.
I'm seeing all C's.
So why not D? No internal, okay. Yeah, great. So C is the best option. You can do your external roost count at those 2 structures. Stationary point survey, you have your 4 habitat types, and mobile transects on that roadway. Again, we're not recommending internal roost counts unless they're done in a very specific way. So that's why D is not the better option. It would be rare to get such a perfect grit cell, but I suppose it could exist.